Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report. Started after 20 minutes of pre-show conversations, little of which actually had to do with the show. But one of these days, we will give you a pre-show taste of what we do. One of these days, we were actually discussing a couple items we could do that would give you sort of that taste. Some things, of course, we cannot repeat on air because I do value this small but strong platform. And without any further ado, just getting into some of the big stories of this week or past week or so. We have, of course, our on the ground updates in Ukraine brought to you by our good friend GSP over here. And then we'll get into some of the economic crises within the US and Europe, get into some of Biden's really, I don't like to use this word too much in a very serious context, some of Biden's unhinged comments. And we just do have a few other items, again, relating a lot to the state of the economy in the world right now. But without further ado, I will hand it over to you to give us some on the ground updates in Ukraine.
Okay. So it's time for your minutia minute.
I'm
Ukraine
gonna, yeah,
updates.
I'm gonna start calling it that. Thank you.
Minutia minute. It's not going to be just 1 minute. Anyhow, so there's a lot going on. I guess the biggest takeaway right now is the amount of shelling that is going on primarily in Donbass by the Ukrainians. Now, they're mostly shelling from a town right on the border of the Donetsk Republic border, not the full state, but the border from the Minsk Agreement of 2015. So it's very close to Donetsk, the city, and it's a town called Adivka. And they have shelled several places, and I would say in 1 week, no less than 50 civilians have been killed. Now, there has been shelling in the south in Bryansk, which is on the Azov Sea, but west from Mariupol. Three were killed there. The worst I saw was a shelling in a town outside of Lugansk city in Lugansk province, and that killed 22 people as a result of multiple shells on apartment buildings. And this is what they've done. Now, sometimes they think that the Wagner group is in one of these towns on rotation, so they immediately start shelling. But the truth of the matter is, Ukraine has been doing this kind of shelling on city centers, markets, schools, even a maternity hospital just yesterday for quite some time, for years, in fact. And there's all kinds of rationale why they do it. Part of it is to demoralize the people there. Look, Russia can't help you. Look what we're doing to you. You can't stop us. Another reason is, for instance, back in 2014 and 15, several artillery units shelled schools, and they hit 6 schools, which could not have been an accident. So they're targeting schools, and the reason for this is because, well, uh, everybody becomes a war criminal, so you can't leave. You're tainted as well, right? It's kind of like Rene Girard's idea of Memeticism in his book I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning, where one person says crucify him and then everyone says so, or one person says, one person throws a stone at the prostitute and then everybody else does. So there's a kind of memeticism that's at work there, and it creates a group, you know, a group that is bound by this illicit act. Um, but I think also, what they're probably trying to do is draw attention away from the major fighting that is now taking place in around Slavyansk. The Russians have gone past Svetogorsk, and as I said on the last show, and now they are on the outskirts of Slavyansk. And the last bridge from Severodonetsk was blown up by the Ukrainians, which the Ukrainians blamed on the Russians, but it was not the Russians. And so all the fighters that are now stuck at the Azot chemical works uh, cannot cannot get out. They will have to swim their way out if they decide that they can't hold on to it. Now, there are civilians, some say in the hundreds, that are trapped in there. There were attempts to free them. Very few have escaped from what I've seen. The Russians introduced a 12-hour ceasefire in order to create a safe corridor. If this sounds like Mariupol, then yeah, it is like a mini Mariupol. Uh, they are trying to hold on for as long as possible. I'm guessing um, for optics such as the upcoming NATO meeting at the end of June. So I think they want to be able to last in there for about 2 weeks. The thing is, I don't believe that the Russians are going to storm the Azot plant right away for several reasons. One is it's not particularly, I mean, it has built-in fortifications like the Azovstal metalworks and the Lenin metal factory in Mariupol. That's true, but it does not have it to the same scale. There aren't as many floors underground. Uh, Most of all, the Ukrainians do not have the kind of provisions in Severodonetsk, in this chemical works that they had in the metal works in Mariupol. So they're going to run out of supplies more quickly. The other reason is even if they did beat them, they would have to cross a river to attack the sister city on the other side of the river. It's literally like less than 5 kilometers away. And that would make them very vulnerable because Lysychansk, as I've said in other programs, is elevated. It's above um, Severodonetsk, and it would give them a great vantage point to pick them off. What I do think is going to happen is because of Popasnaya falling all those weeks ago, it is now bloomed and it's expanding. This salient is expanding in every direction and it is closing in from the southeast and southwest of Lysychansk. My guess is they are going to cut off Lysychansk and Severodonetsk eventually from a south by southwestward direction. To do this, they would probably most likely go after Slavyansk and Bakhmut, which is sort of like a sister city to Slavyansk. Although it's a little further away in comparison to distances between Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Um, Part of the reason that they're doing this is by a huge number of Ukrainian forces now will be trapped. There are no great direct roads that can get in to resupply this cauldron that is forming around Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. So they are having to find other ways, back roads, and all the such, in order to supply fortifications in Lysychansk. Um, Now, Avdiivka, which is, I said earlier, shelling Donetsk and Lugansk, this is an extremely well fortified town, very much like Popasnaya. Uh, I would say it probably has even more fortifications, but it doesn't have the advantage of being on an elevated ground. Nonetheless, it has pillboxes, trenches, multiple levels in some of the pillboxes. So it is capable, very capable of defending itself and trying to attack it head on with an army force that's about one-on-one compared to the Ukrainians. The Russians do not outnumber, they have never outnumbered the Ukrainians in any battle that they've ever fought with them. And in most battles, the Ukrainians have outnumbered them. So my guess is they're going to want to take care of the cauldrons that are behind Avdiivka. uh, as I said, in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk cauldron, and in the new cauldron that's forming now in the Bakhmut, Slavyansk. So you're going to see from, a closing in from Izium and from the Donetsk, from Popasnaya, sequester this off. And by doing so, they're going to get behind Avdiivka. And this will cut off Avdiivka from getting supplies in order to keep shelling. Now, some of the supplies that the West has been giving them have already been blown up, but a good majority of them are still useful. Most of them get through. Like when you hear people selling uh, Western arms destined for Ukraine on the black market appearing in the Middle East, most of these are going to be uh, man pads. They're going to be shoulder guided missiles. They're not going to be artillery pieces, whether they're the kinds that are being drawn. They're certainly not going to be like a French Caesar mobile artillery gun, right? That's not what that's not that stuff is coming through. And it is that stuff which is being used against Donetsk and Lugansk right now. But what they'll eventually want to do is cut off all the supplies, and then they will be surrounded essentially. And there won't be any way that they can get any more armaments. Now, we know that some of this is already starting to take effect, and that's because even according to the Ukrainian military, um, they're firing about 500 artillery 5,000 artillery shells a day. The Ukrainians are claiming 7 to 10 times that. Now, uh, last week we also talked about the MLRS, the rocket launch platform trucks that Ukraine has received. We were told that they're not going to get any long distance missiles. They will. Like when they say they won't, they will. And when they say that they won't be precision guided, you can bet that they will be precision guided. However, they are not firing multiple rockets. They're firing one out of these tubes that can hold between 6 to 12, right? So they're being rationed. And now, to substantiate what I'm saying, because when you don't have as many bullets and missiles and artillery shells and mines, uh, you're going to suffer, and that is exactly what has happened. Back in early June, Zelensky said that about 60 to 100 Ukrainians are dying, Ukrainian soldiers, that is, and now they're saying it's 250 to 350. They're experiencing casualties between 700 to 1,000 a day, with about a third of that being dead to a quarter dead. So these are huge losses on a daily level, um, and that's mostly because they can't fight back. They do have well fortified positions. They have been preparing for this war for 8 years. They have combat experience. They are more mobilized. Even though they're fighting what was up until February a peacetime group, Russian army, except for the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic militias, who are very seasoned. Um, so that doesn't bode well. As far as the other fronts, in the south in Kherson, there is a spit of land that is part of the entranceway into the Dnieper River. That is now completely under Russian control, and Russians have now regained much of the territory that they lost around Kharkov, and fighting has resumed there. And what I'm told is that there have been heavy losses. The Ukrainians have tried for the fifth time, just east of the Kharkov battlefield, to cross the Severodonetsk River. It should be easier now because with the warmer weather and with spring fading into summer, the water levels are going to go down. There have been 5 attempts, none of them have succeeded. It has been costly, and it's been costly if you listen to a few episodes back from both sides trying to cross this river. But so far, the Ukrainians have tried about 5 times, and it has not been successful. And I think when you look at uh, the desperation that the West is in right now, there are conflicting voices. Let's start with America. Blinken was saying that Ukraine will win this war, and then you have Biden telling him you can't say that. You can't falsely raise people's expectations like that. Um, and you have, of course, European leaders today in Kiev. We had Scholz, Macron, Ioannis, the president of Romania, and Mario Draghi, the president of Italy. Now, according to Zelensky, according to Mario Draghi, Zelensky did not ask them for more armaments. Now, they have made all kinds of crazy claims, like we need 2,000 armored personnel carriers, we need 500 more tanks, we need 560 jets. This the West can't supply this, obviously. They are at capacity. Um, even the man pads are in tall order, but
I mean, he's
um,
grabbing to the point where it seems like Albania and Montenegro are his new, let's just say, uh, the new chance he's taking in order to get more aid
yes,
because
that's
he
right.
met with delegations from both Albania and Montenegro in Kiev. So it's gotten
That's
desperate where
right.
he's talking to Montenegro, which isn't even a nation of, I think it's about 500,000 people. Albania, of course, is much larger, but neither of these nations are particularly wealthy or powerful in a military sense, or would have that much of a stockpile to arm Ukraine from.
Right, right. Now Macron also met with the president, the female president. Her name escapes me now, of Moldova, and he wants quick ascension for Moldova to get into the EU. I think this is a lot of talk. I don't know what to make of it. I think a lot of it is symbolic. They reiterated that it would take Ukraine a long time to be accepted into the EU, but they would put it on a path. Turkey has been on a path to the EU for 30 years, so you know, take that how you will. Um, the other the other bit of news, maybe to expand a little bit on the way this war is being fought, the different uh, battle doctrines of each side. So, in the Soviet Union, the idea was that the West would always have superior air power, so superior air defenses would have to be created. From World War II, the Germans relied on very heavy tanks because supply lines were very far. So they needed tanks that could survive. They needed high rates of survivability. This is one of the reasons why I think the Ukrainians are so adamant about getting Panzer IIs, any of the heavy duty Western tanks that primarily Germany is making. Um, Germany also unveiled a completely brand new tank, but it's not in production yet. The Russians right now do have to deal with an army that is very similar to their own. So they're very good at artillery. Both sides are very proficient at artillery warfare. That's what has been going on the last 6 weeks, is heavy, heavy artillery duels between two sides. And because, I mean, early on, the Russians destroyed, probably by the end of March, a huge number of S-300 air defense systems, but there are still a ton of Buk systems, and again, more Stinger manpad types of weapons that can take out helicopters and Su-25s. Um, So what that is forcing the Russians to do is not have their air force fly too far out of the front line, so that they don't get shot down. At the beginning of the war, there was almost like this maverick cavalier attitude, trying to invade Kharkov with light infantry fighting vehicles, which got shredded right away, probably because they thought that according to what the mayor was saying, that uh, the the forces there would capitulate very quickly, but that didn't happen. So this is a long drawn out affair. Um, that said, the Russians are making huge gains, and their losses are a fraction of what the Ukrainians are going through right now. The losses that the Russians were having, let's say at the beginning of the war, between 80 to 90 casualties a day. I mean dead. I don't mean wounded. Um, that is far lower now. I would say that's half, based on what I've seen. Um, the sum total from late February to now is like 63, 65 dead per day. So if we understand it was 85 to 90 at the beginning, well, then it has to be less than 60 now to arrive at 60. And that's primarily because they just have so many more bullets, shells, missiles that they can launch. They don't have to hide as much. This gives them more maneuverability. And that is what's making the difference, is that Russia has this incredible ability, because it's right on their border, to resupply their army. And their army is on rotation, lots of rotation, not a huge force, but a lot of rotation, and that keeps the morale up. With what I'm seeing from the Ukrainian side, is there are all kinds of videos that are popping up of recruitment attempts on the beaches of Odessa, in Western Ukraine as well. And you see young lads trying to get away on their motorcycles. Um,
Yes, as well as the failed conscription drives we talked about a few weeks back, involving
yeah,
both minority groups such as Hungarians and Rusins, as well as the actual Ukrainian stock itself, where they're trying to lower the standards and increase the pool of people in which they can draw to compel into service, but even that can only go so far.
right. And I guess uh, I mean, there was just today, there was, even according to Ukrainian sources, 90 Ukrainians who were killed in the southern theater around Kherson. Um, Now the Russians have been shelling barracks again, and they have blown up two ammunition depots, where some tanks and armored cars were also destroyed, along with the ammunition. Um, yeah, so here it is. Over the past day in Kherson theater of conflict, the Ukrainian army forces lost over 90 people killed and wounded. A unit of 2A-65 Mitsa B-152M towed howitzer artillery, three tanks, and two armored vehicles and an ammunition depot. Um, so the other bit of news is two Americans, and now today I've just heard that there's a total of three Americans, but we have photos of two Americans who have been captured in the Kharkov region, the Kharkov theater. Um, yes, so here they are. 39-year-old Alexander Druk, former Marine, and Andy Huyn, 27, who is also there. Um, the third, I don't know. I haven't seen his photo yet. Like I say, it's just today that I'm hearing about this third person. What's going to happen? I don't know. I think since I don't think I don't think on the last show we brought up that sentences for uh, Aslan and what's his name? Uh, Pinner were handed out. Now they they were sentenced to death for fighting as mercenaries in the Donbass region. Both of them have been there for several years. I don't know what to say about it. I'm very saddened. Uh, I'll be honest. I wish that they would not. I'm going to probably have people hate me for this, but I wish they would not sentence them to death. Um, there are arguments whether they are protected by the Geneva Convention or not. Some argue that they are, some argue that they are not. Um, this is based on whether they're actually mercenaries or working for the Ukrainian government. You know, but that's a very blurry line. I remember in 2014, after the failed attempt by the Ukrainian forces at Ilyavolsk in August, I literally remember watching some of the guys that got captured there, and they were sentenced to death, and it's bad,
Yeah,
you know.
I would tend to agree, and not to let them off the hook or say they didn't do anything wrong, but it just seems needless, especially in the context of the broader conflict. Like, it seems like, and pardon me if this isn't a good word to use for it, it seems like overkill to do something like this. But I digress.
Yeah, I mean, people have said, well, if they do this, then fewer mercenaries. Well, mercenaries going to fight in Ukraine has dramatically decreased. That's according to the Russians. That's with their spy network in Ukraine. And I don't know how much of a force they really are right now. I mean, yes, obviously they are. That's what's keeping Severodonetsk as a hotspot. It's tying up thousands of Russian and Lugansk forces in that area. So yes, which is freeing up the guys in Avdiivka to bomb Donetsk and Lugansk. But um, you know, I guess I'm a softie. I don't know what to say. I wish none of these guys had like why even go, honestly. Big mistake. Big mistake. They should never have gone.
Yes, I would agree. And then with the on the ground updates about Ukraine out of the way, I just do have a few other items related to Ukraine, mostly about outside statements involving Ukraine. So I'll start regarding the statements made by the Pope and the backlash that is drawn. So you'll recall a few months back that he said the West also bears some responsibility for the outbreak of this conflict. Now,
Hmm.
as people overlooked, he also did tell the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, who has also been sanctioned by the British government as of now. So that may be a sign of things to come, even though the sanctions didn't go through in the European Union. But I'll get into that in a minute. He told him he needed to stop being so pro-Putin, so to speak. But he's come out again, and even without that qualifier, he has said that the West does bear some responsibility for the outbreak of this conflict, which has drawn the ire of many at this time. And again, regardless of, and I know we have quite a few Catholic viewers, so I mean, regardless of whether you're pro this pope or aren't satisfied with what he's done, as his time as pope, that's whatever. But taking this statement objectively, not knowing who said it, I mean, it seems like a pretty reasonable middle of the road statement that you would get out of this, say, from 2015, 2016, towards the beginning of the war. And now that everyone, well, not everyone, but a significant amount of people in the West have fallen in this trance that it was this unprovoked Russian all out offensive to conquer an innocent neighbor, his statements have become rather radical. Of course, the journalist class and even a few politicians were really dissatisfied with this statement, No word from Washington about this. Now, of course, Biden being at least a self-proclaimed Catholic, and his little incident during his visit to the Vatican, whatever you believe about that, there's been no statements out of the White House about that. I do believe it was one of the Western governments. I think it was one of the British government's attaches to the Vatican, one of their diplomatic posts to the Vatican, called in his counterpart and expressed his dissatisfaction with the statements. And there were a few instances of that, but nobody has directly confronted the Pope about this. And I probably don't think they will because despite how weakened religious institutions have come in the West, that is still one where a ground where a lot of people won't tread, even if it's just out of fear of backlash from a Catholic population in said country. So you've had that happen, and I think it is a bit of a sign of things to come. I do think that uh, being someone who you could say is more or less in line with the Empire's agenda, I would say so at least, is trying to signal that maybe it's time to take a different approach to this. It does almost remind me of the Henry Kissinger statements on it. And I keep going back to those because I think those are very significant. So, as I said before, Kissinger's probably the only person alive in the West who could make that statement and not face any serious amount of backlash. And I do think just through the office of the papacy, you could have the Pope, no matter who it is, also make a statement like that. Now, again, it will incur more backlash, and again, even just some reflective anti-Catholicism, especially from, I suppose you could say, the formerly Protestant world of, say, the UK, US, etc. But I think out of the handful of people who could say that same, either needs to be a seasoned foreign policy quote unquote expert like Kissinger, or somebody in the role of a religious authority, especially that of the Catholic Church, would be able to say those sort of things. And I think that they're slowly but surely using this. And I'm not saying it's this grand coordinated plan, but I mean, these people do cooperate. There is a general understanding of what the narrative is. Some people, if you want to use Moldbug's terms, which I think are hit or miss, I'll be honest. You could say that the cathedral, which no pun intended, seeing as we're speaking about the speaking about the Pope, that's not what I was actually going for, but it kind of works, I suppose. But you have that, but it seems that they're trying to shift this away. They're trying to ease the population and even some of the political establishments into accepting the idea that Ukraine might be something of a lost cause, that Ukraine may be forced to come to the bargaining table, and that we can't support this war effort forever without it exploding into, again, no pun intended, into something much larger. And that, of course, follows Wesley Clark, who was one of the former commanders of NATO, very prominent American uh, military officer. You'll recall he's the one who laid out the 5 countries in 7 years, or
Hmm.
7 countries in 5 years, whichever it was, talking about how
Yeah.
they had the plans for all these regime changes throughout the 2000s. He was the one who laid that out. And he was saying that Ukraine has no chance unless there is a full intervention on the side of Ukraine by NATO countries, saying that
Yeah.
Ukraine stands no chance. So it does seem that there is almost a bit of divergence where you're getting some in the establishment saying that, okay, maybe it's time to throw in the towel on this. Maybe it's time to realize the more realist side, as we were. And then there's the more idealistic side, the more jingoistic side, represented by, say, a Wesley Clark in this case, saying that we need to go hard, we need to go fast, we can't let Ukraine fall because blah, 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 blah. And I do think it's leading up to either one of the two. And honestly, I don't think the status quo of just a trickle of aid to Ukraine, and once again, Ukraine is requesting another $1 billion from the United States, which they in likelihood will get, and about 6 in 10 Americans, according to a Fox News poll, so take that as you will, do support providing aid to Ukraine. But I don't see the status quo being sustainable, and that it either
Hmm.
will have to lead to an escalation, maybe not to the level that Clark is talking about, or it will need to lead to some sort of negotiation, some sort of throwing Ukraine under the bus, for lack of a better term.
Right. And now U.S. generals have come up with, a kind of strategy as this narrative for the Ukraine war keeps evolving and diverging. And, at the start, they said, yeah, for sure, Russia's not going to win this. And now, I mean, it's gone through all kinds of turns, but now it's pretty obvious that they realize Ukraine is not going to win this. And uh, what is it? Lloyd Austin and his undersecretary basically outlined what the process of funding for Ukraine will probably be like with reference to negotiations. They don't want them to negotiate right now, so they want a more favorable position to negotiate from, which tells you that they're not ready to win or that they can't win. That's probably why they're trying to inflict as much civilian deaths as possible. Um, but it's not really a plan. You're not going to resolve this war if you want to hurt the Russians enough to persuade them. I think the Russians right now, except for the speed with which the war is going, I don't think the Russian government, Putin, or the public is ready to negotiate. I don't. They're not concerned what it is the Ukrainians want. They certainly don't trust the Ukrainians anymore, nor do they believe that it is the Ukrainians who are really behind the negotiations. Ultimately, it will be the Westerners who will have the last say, and it is they which have to capitulate. Now, the London Times had a headline basically saying, "Give the Russians what they want and end this war." Liz Truss has, you remember Liz Truss, who is partly responsible for Brits going in and fighting in Ukraine, has also said we need to have negotiations. But Ben Wallace was in Ukraine, and this might fit into some kind of um, strategy of ambivalence, because all countries do strategic ambivalence. But he was saying he's confident that Ukraine can still win. Like, it's
Oh, I'm
absurd.
certain.
Yeah, yeah. So he believes that the Russians are going to get exhausted. Uh, all of this is projection. The Russians, who's more exhausted than the Russians? The Ukrainians. The Russians have lost personnel and military material. You know who's lost more? The Ukrainians, right? It's the Ukrainians that are begging for supplies, right? So I strongly doubt that uh, the Russians are in any way interested in resuming negotiations anytime soon.
Yes, I would say so. They clearly have the upper hand. In which case, if they were to resume negotiations, and they would have a at least semi-cooperative Ukraine, they probably could extract a bit. But at this rate, just from a purely strategic and tactical point of view, if you want to say, they have no reason to pursue negotiations. And despite some uproar, the sanctions and the situation at home has been bearable. A lot of Russia has unified behind the war. Of
Hmm.
course, once again, there has been dissent, but
It's very
either
small.
through threats of force or through just the public sentiment, anti-war demonstrations have all but ceased. And with that, once again, you'll notice a lot of the claims early on in the first couple months of the war of Russian blunders or Russia underperforming or whatever have all but dissipated. And at this rate, all you hear about is Ukraine is desperate. Ukraine needs aid. Ukraine needs more support. Ukraine needs another $1 billion. Ukraine needs more ammunition that only specifically comes from Bulgaria. Stuff like that is all you hear nowadays, and
Hmm.
seldom do you hear about the Russian blunders. And once again, we can have that conversation. Maybe Russia did underperform in this war, but as you were saying, for every mistake Russia made, Ukraine has incurred far worse and has less to go on. And if it's a war of attrition, if it's a pure war of attrition, Russia absolutely has the bag, barring what again Clark said, an outright intervention in support of Ukraine, which I don't think is going to happen. I think they'd love for it to happen. I think they'd love to push that limit, but I don't think it's feasible. Which brings me on to one of the other points I was going to get at, where when it comes to the approval of Biden within the United States, when it comes to the approval of the job that the U.S. government is doing, I saw a clip from CNN of all places. They had some talking head or expert on, and he was talking about that the disapproval rating of Joe Biden at this point in his first term in office, or is higher than what Jimmy Carter's was in the same time in office. Again,
Mm-hmm.
just that year and a quarter that, or I suppose it's actually a year, almost a year and a half now that Biden's been in office. But Jimmy Carter had something along the lines of a 65 or 66% disapproval rating, whereas Biden is up to 71. And these are particularly on economic issues. As an aggregate, when you consider everything else, I don't know what it looks like, but I can't imagine much better. But just speaking about the economy in particular, it is at 71%. And even the talking heads on CNN were very critical of Biden. Now, it didn't get close to the level of vitriol that they would have, say, used against somebody like Donald Trump, but it was getting pretty close. Of course, they didn't cross that threshold. And also, conspicuously, Kamala Harris hasn't been in the public eye for quite some time now. I can't think of the last time I
Mm-hmm.
saw a public appearance or even a public statement by her people when it comes to this. And some are speculating that they are gearing up to put her in office. There were, of course, the reports of the leak to the Canadian government that it's very possible Kamala Harris will take office after the midterms, regardless of the outcome, that Joe Biden will either be impeached or step down voluntarily by the end of 2022, which isn't surprising. As we were saying, he had those unhinged statements that he had made previously in regard to the oil company. I do actually have uh, some documentation regarding that, a letter I will read out in relation to that situation, but we'll also have a few other economic figures to go through. But it does look like, in light of both the world stage, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, and I would say even much more so the domestic stage, public sentiments have certainly turned against Biden, and it's getting to the point where even the elites, even his establishment, which was overjoyed when he was able to remove Trump from office, was overjoyed when he was able to, again, take power and the adults back in the room, whatever. It seems like even those people have turned their guns on him, so to speak.
Yeah, he is extremely unpopular right now, and people are, I think, rightfully very concerned about the economy. Consumer consumer confidence, if you want to use that horrible sounding metric name, is at the lowest since something like 1952. So things aren't, going very well, and most people are very concerned about the immediate future. And if it's bad in the US, well, inflation in Europe is through the roof. Real inflation. The Baltic states, for instance, it's 18 to 20 to 21% inflation. The Estonian government has been dissolved. Scholz in Germany is looking shaky. Uh, for instance,
Naturally, Italy's government is always on the edge.
yeah, but they love that. That's so Italian, and they do that when things are going well.
Oh,
Uh,
wait, does that mean Italy's
Boris,
about to get stable government now that things are going bad? I kid, but that's actually what usually happens. I mean, just look into the rise of Mussolini, like just for a
I
contemporary
was just gonna
example.
say that. I remember the last time Italy had a state. I mean, no critique. So, I will say, I mean, Boris Johnson, for instance, he's not looking good, even though he won this vote of confidence with less support than Theresa May. Um, it's not. I mean, there are going to be serious repercussions, and even Russian officials are outwardly just saying that this is going to hurt Europe worse than it's going to hit us. And if you look at the stats, so 67% more gas now is going to China than it was last year. Uh, India has doubled its consumption of Russian oil. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that America is still receiving Wall Street oil, crude oil, vis-a-vis third parties, which is, the we've discussed on the show how a ship goes into port, it's given this oil, it's less than 50%, it's Russian, but it won't be counted as Russian. That's still going on, and they're paying for it through the nose on the spot market, which is not like the contract agreement. And then the latest blunder is the Nord Stream 1, not Nord Stream 2 pipeline needs repairs. And so gas flow to Europe is a serious problem. Now, it's some kind of a turbine that needs to be fixed, and that turbine can be fixed in Canada. However, Germany and Canada both have sanctions to get through in order to repair it and reinstall it into Nord Stream 1. If a picture of like the worst sanctions regime policy ever concocted has just happened in 2022. If that's what you're thinking, you're exactly right. It is one blunder after another.
Well, I actually
Uh,
saw an interesting thing that you brought up China, which reminded me of it. That the CIA has a real bombshell that they just dropped on us that China's secret plan to undermine America and the West is to sit back and do nothing.
yeah, well, like, I mean, haven't we been saying that for years? Like,
Yes, yes, we have.
like, so, um, so things aren't going well. I mean, here's some more news. So Russia has essentially made up its losses from all its assets and foreign reserves that were frozen at the beginning of March this year. So much so that all workers in Russia, government workers, so we're talking about teachers, doctors, and so on, they are going to get a raise. Uh, Even Sakhalin Island is workers there are going to get raises. So even far, far eastern Russia. Um, Part of this is because there was huge inflation when the ruble was like hitting nearly $2, and now there's deflation. So prices are slowly coming back down in Russia. Um, from what I see, I don't think like Russia has problems, but it's the same problems they had prior to the war, but problems directly made responsible by the war, those are dissipating right now. Uh, Russia is in a deflationary stage. Prices for food and other commodities are going down. The interest rate has been cut down from 11.5 to 9.5 or 9. Recently, there's talks that it's going to be lowered yet again. Interest rates in America are going up, particularly for homes. So now uh, essentially it's going to get harder, as if it wasn't already after COVID. So I think the Russians have some very good, very talented people in the government staff who were well prepared for this and are dealing with it much better than even they suspected. Like their economic minister, Bolina, expected things to be much worse. So, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. Cars are very inexpensive. Lada apparently is going to be taking over Renault. They're going to use this facility to basically make good, reliable, cheap cars uh, for the average Russian. Um, Luxury items, of course, are going to be super expensive, but even prices for phones have been decreasing now in the last 4 or 5 weeks. So all that talk about, well, the Russian economy is going to tank. Just you wait by June. That hasn't happened. That's not going to happen.
Yes, and that is again what they've been telling us, especially since about 2014 when they first implemented the sanctions on Russia, that the Russian economy is going to collapse by X date or Y date or Z date. No pun intended with the Z date, but with that being said, you have had these projections. Now, this has been a historical trend when it comes to the West view of Russia that it is always on the brink of collapse. That once whoever is out of power, Russia will collapse. Once whatever happens, Russia will collapse. It's something that they've been predicting for the past 500 years, and only a few times has ever come close to coming true. I mean, we have to remember that Russia both recovered from the 1917 revolution and from the Soviet collapse in 1991. They have seen far worse days than whatever pain these sanctions are causing
Yeah.
them. And even in recent memory, even in living memory, for example, 91 is in living memory.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. And Russia just bought a Canadian gold mine, and Coca-Cola is leaving Russia for good.
yes, I saw
And
the new
yeah,
the
you saw
new
that
yeah
Zakharova said,
the new
What will
monkey
we?"
soda
Yeah,
or
the
whatever it
monkey
is.
said it. Zakharova said, Whatever will we use to clean rust with?"
Yeah, I can't wait. You know, if I ever go to Rush one day, getting one of those monkey sodas while eating at a Don Mac. You know, it's
Yeah.
like the Golden Arches win again. You know, you can change the name, but you can't change the heart or soul, I suppose. That statement can be interpreted in many ways, in which case I do intend for you to interpret it a few ways. But I will digress on that for now. But you had brought up, of course, how the economy is going in Europe, and you discussed some of these things, and there were just a few interesting points, and I do harken back to many of even just regular people in Europe heralding the return of a Biden administration, heralding the return of a sane administration within the U.S. That Trump is gone, his bombastic ways are gone, and that the adults are back in the room, as I had said previously. And now Europe's suffering the worst economic crisis since 2008 at more or less the hands of the American empire. So just a few items that I had for that. Just a couple items I had for that. Um, so the energy company in Italy, Eni, that's ENI, says that gas flows from Gazprom are down about 15%, and the German economic minister Habeck said that there were restrictions on energy deliveries from Russia. He said that they were political and not technical. Of course, as we mentioned before, gas flow to China is increasing, of course, because all that oil and gas that used to flow into Europe is now flowing into China. And on related sanctions news, you had the U.S. pushing firms to do more deals with Russian companies over fertilizers because they fear a food shortage. And while that's happening, we're still threatening sanctions against countries that are buying fertilizer from Russia, particularly in Africa and particularly in the Middle East. So you have all of that happening, and you could argue that perhaps those sanctions are there as a way, and that we're bending our own rules in order to put ourselves in a more advantageous position, so we get it before they do. Because if the fears of shortage are as expected, then things are going to be very bad for the less developed world. I mean, they're not going to be fun in the first world or anything, but they're going to be very painful. And some of the more doomsday predictions that they would have made in the early 2000s about famine in Africa and the Middle East may come true. Now, they blamed, what they would have called back then global warming on that, but it looks like this is a purely manufactured crisis, whether by the incompetence of the leaders, bombasticness, or maybe if you want to put on your tinfoil hat, something a bit more coordinated. Now, I think it's possible that's a combination of all the three, but point being is some of the worst projections for the mid to late 2020s seem to be paying us a bit of an early visit, so to speak, and there were some figures out of the U.S. when it came to the economy. So just to put it in perspective, this is from Charlie Balelo, and now I don't know who that is. Just a guy with a blue check mark on Twitter. Just one of the many people. So, and I quote: In January 2021, the 30-year mortgage rate in the U.S. was 2.65%, and the average price of a new home was $401,700. and that's compared to, again, today in 2022, so just about a year and a half later. 30-year mortgage is 5.78% interest, and average new home is $570,300. Now, this is of course calculating the standard 20% down payment. That's a 106% increase of the monthly payment. Just to put in that perspective, a monthly payment would have gone from 1,294 to 2,671 just in the course of about a year and a half. So, I'm no economist. I think a lot of it is what's the word for it? Witchcraft. I think a lot of it is made up on the fly. Now, perhaps it just shows my lack of understanding, but that's aside the point. And this is on top of the U.S. Federal Reserve's raising interest rate from to 1.75%, which is the largest hike since 1994, and of course it was a hike of 75 basis points. So it looks like they're trying to curb this, but at this rate, again, in my tenuous understanding of interest rates in the Fed, that this could actually have unintended consequences that could actually backfire. And then once again, U.S. retail sales in May have been dragged down by a plunge in vehicle purchases. So just all around, when it came to the economic news out of the U.S., it is not pretty, and in fact, it's worse in Europe. It's suspected that Italy and Greece may go bankrupt by the fall,
Hmm.
and that Germany may be bankrupt by early next year. And uh, you know, I know Italy has been a bit of an economic basket case, and I know maybe I give it disproportionate attention because of my own ethnic background, but I think we all have to keep in mind that it is the third largest economy in the European Union. It used to be the fourth, but after the UK left, it's been bumped up to the third largest economy in the European Union, up there with Germany and France. I didn't see any figures about France or what its bankruptcy timeline would be, but point being is you're having major economies like Italy and like Germany, and then the economic black hole that is Greece, that a country that has struggled for many years, and no thanks to, I mean, actually great thanks to European Union economic policy being imposed on it, you have just this impending economic crisis. So I suppose if anyone wants to make investments into Europe, just give it a few months if you want to buy some cheap land. But I'm not going to show too much of my own hand here. And Spain was one of the other countries that was projected to go bankrupt by autumn. And Spain, while not as bad as the other southern European nations, has still not done well. And of course, these are all contingent on sanctions in Russia not being lifted in the near future, in which case we would be talking about the next few weeks and the next couple of months. So you have, again, all of those factors being taken into consideration and bringing back the question I have asked since the outbreak of this conflict: how much pain will Europe tolerate for the American empire? And frankly, I think the question should be expanded: how much pain will the average American tolerate for the empire at this rate?
Hmm. Ultimately, it's going to come down. Well, it is going to come down, I think, to the public to some degree. But I can't help but notice how much America got what it wanted. Um, just to contrast that with Trump, right? Like this is what's so ironic is that the Europeans really didn't like Trump. They felt that Trump didn't understand Europe very well. The British certainly didn't like him because there was already a tug of war between, I would say, the EU and Britain, and that's still ongoing. Whether we're talking about Northern Ireland, whether we're talking about fishing disputes in the English Channel, and migrants between the UK and France, there was an attempt, uh, I think, particularly with Trump, to carve out a portion, let's call it the intermarium 3.0, but to carve out a particular kind of support amongst the Poles and the Hungarians and probably the Romanians as well, as a bulwark against Russia. So Trump could, like, he was much more subtle. I mean, if you add up what Trump did
Well,
to
that's a
make,
first.
yeah. But, so you see what I mean? Like he was moving in on this territory that essentially the EU wanted to crack down on. Okay. The EU has wanted to bring Poland and Hungary into line. And often we forget about a country like Romania. But I remember in 2019, there's a lot of laws that are being rolled back that have to do with gay rights. And there's an assertion, a cultural assertion. It is not because these countries are warming up to Russia. We saw that last summer with Georgia. Okay. There is a kind of let's say, a traditional kind of revolution happening. Uh, it's really just a reaction to the decadent excesses of the U.S. and how that has become, uh, the dominant soft power approach. Like, yeah, I mean, you can see it played out in Russia, right? So you've got all these people who are used to having the smartphones and having all these kinds of apps available, and they're watching and interacting with all kinds of degenerate stuff. The sanctions are put in place, phone numbers go through the roof, you can't even get on the apps anymore. You're trying to This is a form of soft power, is what I'm saying. However, that said, uh, you can see these countries desperately trying to walk this fine line between receiving the kind of help, economic help, military help, and cooperation from the West, and at the same time not letting the West erode their identity. Now, it's I think the British wanted that slice of the pie in Eastern Europe, and you can see their attempts to form very close relationships with Poland, and now Poland plus Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, right? And but I think there was a feeling that Trump was playing into their hands, and this is why Biden, uh, you know, considered Poland and Hungary dictatorships. Uh,
Not even going as far as to call them totalitarian.
yeah, totalitarian, right? And Brussels, of course, wanted to bring these countries into line as well. Um, so I think there's a struggle that was happening there, and Britain wants a bigger hand in Europe. Uh, I always keep harping on this. When I saw how frustrated and upset Britain became with the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which to me makes no sense. On the one hand, Britain cannot maintain Afghanistan, even though there were cries in Parliament to do so. Um, it's patently ridiculous as that is. Uh, they nonetheless, there were politicians that nonetheless made those kinds of statements. And I think, Britain wants an important role. And but what is it has cost the Europeans everything. They complained that Trump was too boorish. He didn't understand Europeans. He didn't want um, an Eastern Europe that strategically would be good to counter Russia, but culturally would be bad because it would undermine soft power by Western Europe, right?
Yes.
They saw a division forming there, and now the whole thing is wrecked, right? In comes Biden, and Biden basically is saying, "You're all going to go down. I'm going to ruin Germany. I'm going to ruin the economic engine of this entire continent. Uh, whatever scraps I let the UK have, they can have, maybe. We'll see."
Yeah, and
So
even
it's
Biden
ironic that
was
you
he
go ahead.
he was prodding the UK over the Ireland issue, and I saw actually a lot of particularly British conservatives were very unhappy about that. Not that they would have been Biden's biggest supporters in the first place, but I'm talking about a lot of the middle of the road people, at least from my perception, were not very happy about Biden's comment on the Northern Ireland situation.
Hmm.
That was just a few weeks ago, and of course that's been a consistent theme. Biden being so-called, ethnic Irish, and coming from sort
Yeah,
of that white
whatever.
ethnic background. Yeah, he's it's the epitome of the Irish American, and honestly, at this rate, he might as well be. If you, I digress. I digress. But with that being said, you've had tensions with that as well, and whatever Trump's boorish or bombastic behavior, I mean, it pales in comparison to the way Biden has treated Europe. Because I would say, even if you want to attribute, say, Trump was just an ignorant buffoon who just didn't understand, European high life, that's one thing, and that might even be true. But I think it's even worse because Biden, or at least the people around him, do understand Europe, and it seems like they're deliberately going in to really just break the knees of the entire continent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main difference is that Trump was happy with a frozen conflict, and he was happy with, let's say, strengthening Eastern Europe to such a degree that maybe in the near future, Ukraine could do something wild and Russia would be more unprepared. Maybe that was a strategy. But generally speaking, he was happy to play a long game with Russia
Yes, and
and
Trump
to
was a
keep
very
the
big proponent of outsourcing empires, where whether it be to these European states, such as, like, as you were saying, Intermarium 3.0, even tried to prod the Japanese to take a bit more of the burden upon themselves, prod NATO to take a bit more of its burden on
yeah.
itself. Had a very interesting back and forth relationship with Turkey, even though I suppose that's everyone. But Trump was a very big fan, again, once again, of outsourcing imperial responsibility to more local fiefdom, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, he could be cunning in his own way, or at least his staff could. I mean, ultimately, they have very similar goals. Both administrations have to follow very similar geopolitical goals. It's just that his method was more patient. And you
Once
notice,
again, you thought you'd never be saying that about Donald Trump.
you know, well, you notice, like, let's see, 1, 2, 3 months after Biden is sworn into office, we have an emergency, April 2021. Russians are amassing because the Ukrainians are amassing on Donbass. Shelling has increased. Literally the prelude to what started to happen at the end of 2021, and then it all blew up in February 2022. That's how quickly that accelerated. I mean, Ukraine is not going to do that without like Americans telling them to do that. Like when Americans say, "Oh, we're sharing all our data now," as if like America hasn't been sharing all their data with the Ukrainians for the last 8 years, as if they've been holding back. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yes, and again, I mean, the entire impetus for this conflict was quite literally the U.S. and by extension its NATO partners saying, "Well, we got your back if you decide to go into Donbass and Russia decides to respond. We're 100% behind you." And again, you saw this when Biden first came to office that the Ukrainians were very they had this great boost in confidence that they thought they would have in America that would be solidly behind them, as opposed to Trump's more wishy-washy approaches, to Trump's more uh, I suppose you could say, long-term approach. Which, once again, it just saying these things about Donald Trump. I mean, only in comparison to Biden. But with that being said, you had that happen, and of course, the Ukrainians capitalized on the opportunity, believing Washington's promises for whatever reason. I don't know what could have possessed them. Maybe it was just a now or never proposition, even if they weren't entirely sure they would have no other shot at this, and that eventually the conflict would turn against them because time was not on their side, which that is true. Time was not on Ukraine's side when it came to this conflict. That unless there was some major event inside Russia or pertaining to Russia, eventually Russia would have subsumed these eastern parts of Ukraine, whether by force or by otherwise. But I do think we're overlooking one very important factor in all of this, one thing that was taking place in the backdrop of all of.
mm,
Did you know that there's currently primetime January 6th trials going on right now?
no, I mean I do, yes, but I have not been paying attention
Well, neither have I, but I do.
because it's frankly too infuriating.
Yes,
It's too infuriating to watch.
yes, but I bring that up within context because I don't want to talk about anything actually substantive with them, but I want to talk about them in relation to all of this. So
Right.
you'll notice, just, you know, and hell, even if you have to rewind just to our economic section that we did just about 5-10 minutes ago, put that in the perspective of that almost a year and a half later. we are still talking about what is ultimately a glorified trespassing on federal grounds case. Something that would normally be a slap on the wrist, something that would normally they would just simply disperse you with maybe tear gas and rubber bullets at worst. And we do have the one actual casualty from the protesters. I think it was Ashley Babbitt was her name. Again, fired upon by the
Yeah.
Capitol Police during one of the instances during this little dust up. But point being is we have dedicated primetime show trials. Now, once again, the reason they are in primetime, since typically these things would take place during the workday, during the business week, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, the usual. I'm sure you all know that. But they're really eager to turn this into an outright spectacle. They're really eager to turn this into, again, something of a primetime television show. There's a reason they're putting this stuff on at 8 o'clock at night because they want the
Yeah.
public to watch, and they do want the public to root for blue team in this case, but they're willing to throw a few bones to red team. And you can have the hearings, you can have the zingers. I'm sure all of you who really followed the Trump Russia stuff back in the day remember just the constant back and forth, like, oh, look at this zinger, look at some congressman you've never heard of up until 5 minutes ago, just really laying into it. Or again, there was a lot of this during the Trump administration, a lot of media focus on this kind of stuff during the Trump administration, that this hearing is going to break Trump, or this hearing is going to break the Democrats, and that Trump is going to drain the swamp. So it's just more of that, but intensified in on steroids. And they're trying to shift the political conversation to this because otherwise you get even CNN talking about Biden's disapproval rating. And
Yeah.
really, they are pushing this so hard, which is funny because, just speaking personally, I do live in a red area, but I know quite a few staunchly blue Democrats, and even they aren't talking about this. Like, I mean, they'll say a thing or two in passing, but even this doesn't catch their interest. So even like the core audience of this sort of thing is simply just does not care at this point. And again, it is. I don't like to throw these terms around. I don't like to throw this one around in particular because it feels like it used very flippantly. But it's outright a distraction. They're putting this on here so you don't pay attention to other
Yeah.
things. So you don't pay attention to the fact that everything
That's
they've
right.
told you about Ukraine thus far is a lie. So you don't pay attention to the fact that inflation is collectively at 8%, despite all these things, being at 40 some percent this or 30 some percent that. So you don't pay attention to the fact that most people, on average, have paid what is effectively a month's wages in inflation. Again, particularly getting into the economic thing, and then if you want to get into some of the social issues with, some of the, bring your kids to, drag queen hour week or whatever it is. But, I would say they're trying to distract from the economics primarily, then to a lesser degree trying to distract from a lot of the social norms that they are pushing the envelope on each and every day, especially during the so-called Pride Month. But again, they are really trying to push this the idea of an insurrection, the idea that democracy triumphed even on its deathbed against some evil fascistic coup. And perhaps one could say that they're doing this to preempt a Trump 2024 run, even though I have and you have, and this program collectively have, given our distinct opinions on what a Trump 2024 could be. And with that being said, you could say this is something to really shift the narrative about Trump. Maybe they'll have him come out and do a half-hearted denouncement, or they'll have him come out and do whatever. But once again, another angle you can look at this is it's to bend Donald Trump into a more cooperative position, which they have been trying to do, I would say, ever since he's been out of office, and that's what they're really grooming him for in 2024. The new and improved controlled opposition Trump, even more so than before.
I mean, if they really wanted to cut Trump down to size, they could talk about the scam that he performed for the fundraising of the January 6th protesters, how he got the money and he distributed it amongst his friends. None of the men and women who were thrown in jail have received any of those funds for their legal fees. Bannon also had a fund, and he did much the same thing, bought a yacht, and so on and so on. So if they wanted to cut him down to size, they could, but they don't. And that, in a way, maybe supports the argument that they do want a revamped Trump, a Trump that's more like Reagan than a populist right winger who is stands for a kind of moral conservatism
Yeah,
and
so
public
a
life,
Reagan over a
a bit
Nixon, so to
left of
speak.
center in economics. What's that?
A Reagan over a Nixon, so to
Hello?
speak.
Right, right, right. Or I mean, he's his own guy, but yeah, I suppose
Just to use broad
you
terms,
can
but yeah.
right. I mean, ultimately, I think the panic set in with the fact that if Trump got elected, he probably would not have stopped Nord Stream 2. It probably would not have been in his capability to do so, right? I think he knew that it would take a war to stop it. And I think the Biden team said, yes, this is what we'll have. This is what it'll do to Europe. I think Trump, or at least his administration, probably foresaw that the sanctions against Russia would not work and that only a stronger Europe could contain Russia. And that being on very good terms with Eastern European states and not causing Russia to panic, not you know, forcing their hand in Ukraine would be long term would be the best option. However, it appears that I think that the Biden administration was worried, where would Europe go in that scenario? In other words, would Europe become too independent, too strong? In Because it would, as I've said on the show before, it would create very much a multipolar world. And the Biden team basically said, we're going to have a duopoly. We're not going to have a multipolar world. Okay, that's where it's going to be us and China. Europe cannot be given that much power. And I think that's ultimately how things worked out. And if Trump comes back into office, he's very good at making it look like he's doing stuff and he's not. Uh,
Yes, because you'd have 1.5 million Q types who would be out there saying, uh, Donald Trump has got it. You know, you just gotta trust this grand plan that we've been telling you about for. At that rate, by 2024, it would be 8 years now. That of course he's gonna drain the swamp any day. That it's gonna be this just great and wonderful event that is going to bring it back. Of course, while Trump is serving the exact wants and needs of the establishment, even more so than he did before. Because even before, he was a bit of a renegade. He was allowed to go just a little bit even off script, even just here or there, and it would actually do damage. But as we said previously, Donald Trump was scraping the bottom of the barrel.
yeah, so that's ultimately where we are with Trump. I don't know, really what to expect. As I was saying, it's still 2.5 years from now. I mean, you brought up earlier that Kamala Harris might take over. What would that do? Who knows? What would happen? What if by mid-August the situation for Ukraine is even worse? It would be the anniversary of Afghanistan. What would that do? Um, you can see that even Biden has said, Zelensky should have listened to me. I told him from the start that Russia was going to invade, but he didn't pay attention. It's like, well, I mean, he had like 350,000 troops mobilized. That doesn't include the reserves and like, I mean, you're the one who told him to bomb Donbass. I mean, no, technically, we didn't hear you say that, but it's just absurd, right? They're already trying to dump Ukraine right now, and it's important you brought up that the January 6th hearings. They do want to begin a memory hold process now with Ukraine.
Yes, we even saw that in the early weeks, I should say, because we're not even months into it, with some of the monkeypox stuff, which they also sort of put
Hmm.
to rest quickly because of the groups it was primarily affecting. And just when it comes to Biden and his disapproval and just the possibility of him being removed, there was a statement put out by ExxonMobil regarding what Biden said because Biden was castigating these oil companies for both having shortages and making record profits. So I just wanted to read this statement from ExxonMobil. Not that I'm a big defender of theirs, but I think it was interesting in the context of what we were looking at. So ExxonMobil today released the following statement in response to the letter from President Biden. So we have been in regular contact with the administration to update the president and his staff how ExxonMobil is investing more than any other company in the U.S. to develop U.S. oil and gas supplies. This includes investment in the U.S. of more than 50 billion dollars over the past 5 years, resulting in almost a 50% increase of our U.S. oil production during this period. Keep in mind that's just ExxonMobil alone, not even
Hmm.
including other oil
Hmm.
companies. So globally, we've invested double of what we earned over the past 5 years, 118 billion new oil and gas supplies compared to the net income of 55 billion. This is a reflection of our company's long-term growth strategy and our commitment to continuously invest to meet society's needs, demand for our product. Continuing on with this, specific to refining capacity in the U.S., we've been investing through the downturn to increase refining capacity to process U.S. light crude about 250,000 barrels per day, the equivalent of having a medium-sized refinery. We keep investing even during the pandemic when we lost more than 20 billion and had to borrow more than 30 billion to maintain investment to increase capacity to be ready for post-pandemic demand. In the short term, the U.S. government can enact measures often used in emergencies following hurricanes and other supply disruptions, such as waivers of the Jones Act provisions and some uh, let's see, and some fuel specifications to increase supplies. Longer term, the government can promote investment through a clear and consistent policy that the U.S. supports resource development such as regular and predictable lease sales, as well as streamlined regulatory approval and support for infrastructure such as pipelines. So, just a letter from Exxon, more or less castigating Biden for his energy policy while criticizing them in particular and the record profits that they made. And again, um, believe it or not, in my personal opinions, the oil companies are some of the less egregious ones, which I don't know how we got to this point where that's happened because the oil companies have historically been, again, the epitome of the robber baron, so to speak. But with what we've gotten, it's the point where the oil executives look reasonable in the face of the Biden administration, to the point that they have instigated the shortage, that this company has actually been spending more than it's been bringing in, and that their record profits on paper are simply what they aren't, otherwise. And you have them, of course, once again, one of the big, I suppose you could say, oligarchic groups in the U.S. also turning against the president. So the possibility of a Kamala administration, the possibility of a Trump 2024, or whatever else, I think it's gotten to the point where, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised by the beginning of next year we have a new president. And of course, that would fall in the lap of Kamala Harris unless she resigns first, which would put, whoever in the Senate is responsible for fulfilling the vice president's resignation. But point being is, it looks like we are on the path, both from public discontent and from even the establishment itself, to see this administration out the door.
Mm. This has been a very pivotal week, you know. Like, I mean, on the
Extremely.
battlefront, there's been, but everything else, like, again, I always say this: Ukraine is the battlefront, but the war is global, and it's not kinetic in the way that the battlefield is. Um, I mean, it really has been something. Even, I just want to add, Jens Stoltenberg actually, um, on record, said that, you know, um, arguing for peace with Russia for Ukraine, it's not his decision. It's only a decision that Ukraine can make, but will probably mean that he will have to cede territory that he's lost, and not just Donbass and Crimea. Um, we're seeing all kinds of statements that really, even 2 weeks ago, was hard to see. But
Yes, and
yeah.
speaking of Stoltenberg and NATO as a whole, as part of the most recent NATO meetings, Turkey has outright rejected any meeting with Finnish or Swedish delegations in regard to their ascension into NATO. So Turkey has put down a steadfast line that they don't want to see NATO expansion in Sweden or Finland, or at all, I imagine. I don't think that they're in support of any NATO extension at this point, even including some of these, say, what is it? Um, some of these smaller statelets, say in the Balkans or whatever. I don't think Turkey is really in favor of any NATO expansion at this point, which once again
Mm.
stymies the idea of this great unity in the face of a Russian aggressor. And it looks like, really, that regardless of how poorly Russia may have performed, once again, we can have that conversation different time, whatever arguments want to make. I think it is undeniable that for whatever Russia may or may not have done, Ukraine has fared far worse, and the West, frankly, has fared far worse than Russia at the outbreak of this entire thing. And that even if it's the most Pyrrhic victory for Russia, there is absolutely nothing to be won from the West out of this most recent debacle, and that they will take away nothing, which does lead, as I touched at the beginning of the show, fears of more radical action. But I'm at the point where, not only about Ukraine, but as the West as a whole, it's either going to have to retreat and lick its wounds, or it's going to do something bombastic and belligerent that we will, frankly, all suffer the consequences of if they do.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know how much of a Pyrrhic victory this is.
Well, again, I'm just saying.
Even if things stop right now, Russia now has ways of. So it has ways now of reinforcing their front lines, and reinforcing Crimea if it need be, directly from the north without having to go to the, Rostov on Don, and then taking the bridge across, around the Azov Sea. Um, by the way, this train service and bus service is running now.
Yeah,
This
just
is
to
what
clarify
they've wanted.
what
Nobody
what
knows.
what I had meant by that was I was saying if you're going to look at Russia through the worst possible light, that the West has even done worse even by those standards.
Right, 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 right. I mean, the way I look at it is Russia from the beginning has gone into a war outnumbered, and it did it with an army that was highly professional but hadn't been in a war, and it's done overall incredibly well. Um, it had done things, I think, that, you know, for instance, the US in 2003 bombed Iraq more in the first 2 days than Russia did in the first 4 weeks. And I think there was a presumption that, well, we've taken care of, the all the anti-air defense systems when that wasn't the case. Uh, Maybe that was to appear more humanitarian, because I think early on uh, they wanted an agreement with Zelensky. I don't think they wanted this bloodshed, and they gradually had to accept, that there was going to be far more bloodshed. And I think that moment was in late March when they made the decision to pull out before, April the 1st. And that's where we are right now.
Yes, and the last thing I have for today in particular, because once again I feel like we've sufficiently covered Russia and Ukraine thus far, as well as the other news, and of course everyone's favorite president Brandon's wonderful performance. I feel bad for all of you who invested in Brandoncoin. I can't say myself is included in that, but we just have one last bit of news here that China has expanded its military capabilities for several what they called non-war uses. Now, that could include a whole host of things, but people are speculating that maybe this may involve something with Taiwan. Now, you have to remember that still officially China's official policy, the People's Republic of China's official policy, is that Taiwan is their territory, but just occupied by an illegitimate government. They don't view it as a foreign nation. And likewise, with the way the Republic of China, based out of Taiwan, views mainland China, they viewed it as their territory occupied by a renegade government. So some are speculating with China's expansion of their military to non-war uses that could be used for this. Now, we could also consider with its various investments around the world, particularly in Africa and Latin America, that it could be used for, say, civil engineering projects, things like that. So it is interesting that we're looking at China really gearing up, I would say, for a greater presence on the world stage for its military to do more than, say, just its normal mandate of being a combat ready force, either for war or defense. And I think we're looking at something quite interesting going forward with that.
Well, I mean, I think the number one thing that Taiwan wants is, I mean, that China wants by fully incorporating Taiwan. I know it sees Taiwan as Chinese. It considers the agreement that it arrived to with the U.S., who also agreed that Taiwan is a part of China, is valid. But I think that what China wants is it wants the water between itself, mainland China. Sorry, what China wants is between itself and Taiwan. It wants that water no longer international. It wants to be able to control that and basically add an extension, a projection of its power in, because it understands how well trapped it is seaward wise by the Americans. Uh, I mean, if a war would break out um, in in the East between China, I think the sanction packages alone would be enormous. They would change the world in an even more fundamental way than what we've seen develop between Russia and the collective West.
Yes, and looking at, of course, China's economic reach is much further than that of Russia's, and even when it comes to interdependence between the U.S. and China, there's a lot more for the U.S. to hit it on, but there's also a lot more for the U.S. to take hits on. And also, you can look at those trade maps between 2000 and 2020 when it comes to the predominant trade partners in the world. Most of the world's predominant trade partner between the U.S. and China is China, so they will likely side with China on an economic sense than they would with, say, the U.S. So it is a lopsided proposal, and the possibility of China being able to reintegrate Taiwan, being able to take Taiwan, uh, it seems to only grow stronger. It doesn't seem like they face any setbacks in that, and it seems almost as an inevitability at this point that Taiwan will be reintegrated. And I doubt they'll have to use much, if any, military force for that at all.
Yeah, so it's in China's advantage to wait this out. America might want to rush it and spoil it. Now, I think the economic and financial ties between America, the West, and China are in many ways even deeper. So things could be more catastrophic. I don't know. Is the West going to go for broke here? China has the advantage of fighting on its home turf. As we've seen with Russia, it can manufacture, it will probably be able to manufacture its armaments, its artillery, whatever military material it needs to fight much more quickly than Taiwan can. Taiwan will be even more isolated. This will leave America no option but basically high seas piracy in order to disrupt trade. But China's already proven that it's willing to disrupt trade by pretending, like that COVID is back in action in Shanghai. So it keeps tankers from leaving, shipping tankers, that is. Um, so yeah,
Yes, and we've discussed this possibility before, especially when it came to the oil tanker crisis in 2019, that the U.S. may be able to use its massive naval presence as something of a saboteur force, and again, resorting to higher seas piracy. If it can't dominate trade, then it will sabotage any rivals or anyone that stands its way. And once again, I think we have
Mhm.
sufficient precedent with this in the Gulf, not only in 2019, but I think people forget that the U.S. more or less waged a naval war against Iran in 1988 when it tried to stop Iraqi oil from flowing out of the Gulf. So it's not unprecedented, and at this rate, again, if it were
It's
to,
a great point.
yeah, if it were to come to that, I mean, the U.S. already has precedent for that, and even with the deterioration of the military, I think it's still complete within their capabilities to either commit piracy or harass so-called hostile ships in the high seas.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is where it would rely on its. I mean, the reason America has to have a great navy because it's so isolated from the rest of the world. So it would really have to rely on that, and that would be its strong suit. But that would be the only card I'd see that it would have to play. Russians have opened up a trade route using trucks only to China, by the way, and a new trade route has opened up with India vis-a-vis the Caspian Sea to Iran and then over to India. So we've been talking on this show for quite a while that th- that they will be prepared for um, acts of piracy eventually. Like who who knows? It all depends on what U.S. leadership is willing to do. But if I could say one thing before we move to the next topic or close the show, I really love Alexei Arestovich because he's just the craziest guy. I just want to
Oh, his
mention
takes
something
have
he
been
said.
they've been fun to follow to say the least. But do give us some of our Arestovich content.
So, he said it's not going to happen, but just suppose Russia defeats Ukraine and Russia's 1 million army joins the Ukrainian 500,000 army, and probably Belarus will join later. We will become an unstoppable force and destroy Europe's toy armies. Going like, this is the most, the, like, Ukraine really is going on another level. Like, get us the effing tanks here as fast as possible, or we're going to invade you. And it just reminds me, the Cossacks always switching sides for the most favorable outcome. So, anyways, I just thought that was so hilarious. It's so out there. He's very entertaining. I like watching him because he sounds very sophisticated, very confident, and it's just he just says the wildest stuff, and it's getting wilder.
Yes, it's the man is, for lack of a better word, a walking meme, a walking talking meme for that matter. And
Yeah.
you're always sending me his stuff on Telegram, and it's always no matter what I'm doing in the day, it always puts a smile on my face. But that's all I had for this episode. Unless you think we've missed anything, I can go ahead and bring it to a close.
I'll just say for Syria, yes, Israel bombed the Damascus airport. It's horrible. Repairs have already started, and so far it does not look like Erdogan has started the great campaign yet. There's been some incursions, but and the Russians have fought back with the Syrians. They've taken out some. This is, anyways. It's yet to be seen whether there's going to be this great Turkish military maneuver in northern Syria.
Well, as foolish as it is,
But that's all I have.
I'm certainly not wavering on my last summer vidlib. I'm more or less obligated to stick to it at this point, regardless of the outcome. So we'll see if I'm right in a couple months. But the odds are perhaps against me. But with that being said, I suppose we'll see everyone next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.